Colonial America, often portrayed as a land of new beginnings and opportunities, was also a place where punishments could be shocking, brutal, and inhumane. The justice system of the time was rooted in both English common law and harsh local customs that allowed authorities to exercise extraordinary power over the colonists. Whipping posts were commonly used in towns and cities across the colonies, where individuals found guilty of crimes ranging from theft to adultery were stripped of their clothing and tied to a post. They would then be lashed with a cat-o'-nine-tails or a similar whip, causing intense pain and humiliation. Public whippings were meant to disgrace the offender in front of the community, reinforcing the power of the authorities. Public punishment served as both a deterrent and a reminder of the strict social order, making it clear that defying the law had serious consequences. Women accused of adultery were sometimes subjected to the scarlet letter, practice derived from Nathaniel Hawthorne's famous novel, where an adulteress would be publicly branded with the letter A sewn into their clothing. Hanging was the most common form of execution, carried out publicly to serve as a warning to others. Used primarily during the early colonial years, this practice was based on the belief that God would protect the innocent and allow them to survive these trials. One such ordeal involved trial by water, where the accused would be thrown into a river. The authority of the colonial governments was maintained not only through the power of the law, but through fear, humiliation, and the display of brutal punishment. As we continue to explore this horrific chapter in history, we find that the legacy of cruelty still echoes in the modern-day justice system, where debates about fairness, punishment, and human rights are still ongoing. If they sank, they were presumed innocent. If they floated, they were considered guilty of witchcraft. This was a public execution meant to send a strong message about the consequences of defying the moral and religious codes of the time. Although this was less common in the colonies, it still occurred on occasion, particularly in the case of disputes that were not easily resolved through evidence or legal means. Those who were banished were often sent to remote areas far from their homes and communities. The punishment of exile was intended to remove the problem without actually killing the offender. Public humiliation was a powerful tool for asserting authority and maintaining order. The prison system eventually replaced many of the brutal public methods of punishment, but the legacies of these cruel practices continued to shape America's criminal justice system. The move from physical torture to imprisonment signaled a shift towards a more civilized system of justice, but the deep-rooted reliance on punishment for social control remained a significant aspect of colonial governance. Whether it was through branding, whipping, or exposure to the crowd, the intention was to instill fear in the community and force the offender to submit to authority. The fear of public shame was often enough to prevent people from breaking laws, as they feared not just physical pain but social rejection. However, for many, exile was a death sentence in itself. Those banished often struggled to survive in harsh conditions and were left without support or resources. This form of punishment was typically used for political or religious dissidents who defied the colonial authorities, but was also sometimes applied to those who were convicted of lesser crimes. In trial by combat, the outcome of the fight determined the fate of the accused, and this brutal method was often seen as a final test of moral purity. The practice underscored the idea that justice could sometimes be determined by strength and violence rather than evidence or fairness. Those accused of witchcraft, mostly women, were tied to a stake and burned alive. This punishment was not only a brutal death, but a public spectacle designed to humiliate the accused and show the community that witchcraft would not be tolerated. The infamous Salem witch trials of 1692 are one of the most well-known instances of colonial authorities using public torture and execution to deal with accusations of witchcraft. During the trials, young women were accused of consorting with the devil, and they were often tortured in an attempt to extract confessions. The most notorious of these methods was the water test, where the accused were thrown into water to see if they would sink or float. If they floated, they were considered guilty, and if they sank, they drowned. This irrational and horrifying method of testing the accused resulted in the deaths of many innocent people. The method was painful, excruciating, and horrific, often leaving a lingering psychological impact on the survivors or witnesses of such executions. These trials were often irrational and cruel as they relied on superstition rather than evidence. Slavery was entrenched in the economy and society of the colonies, and slave owners had the legal right to punish their slaves however they saw fit. The punishments for slaves could include whipping, branding, and even death. Public humiliation, such as being tied to a post and whipped in front of the community, was used to keep slaves in line and remind them of their subordinate status. In many cases, slaves had little to no legal protection, and punishments were inflicted with brutal force. For minor offenses, the punishment could be harsh physical labor or worse, torture and execution. The sight of an individual swinging from a rope, often in front of large crowds, was meant to instill fear and obedience in the community. Flogging was a common punishment for Quakers who refused to renounce their faith. In some instances, Quakers were banished or forced into labor camps as punishment for their religious practices. One of the most brutal forms of punishment for the Quakers was the stockade or the pillory, where individuals were publicly humiliated and their bodies were exposed to the harsh weather, often leading to injury or death. These punishments reflected the Puritans' belief in religious uniformity and the lengths they would go to suppress dissent. Those accused of serious crimes, particularly witchcraft or espionage, were sometimes subjected to extreme physical and psychological torment in order to extract confessions. Waterboarding, stretching on the rack, and other techniques were sometimes used in the belief that they would force a guilty party to admit to their crimes. This type of punishment was especially common in areas where colonial authorities wanted to ensure the loyalty of their subjects, especially during times of political unrest. The authorities used these executions as a demonstration of their control, ensuring that the colony remained in line with English law and order. While the practice itself was fictionalized in the novel, the real punishments for adultery were equally harsh. Whippings, fines, and public shaming were common for both men and women who violated these moral codes. The accused would be locked into these wooden contraptions, often in a public square, where they would be forced to endure public humiliation. The stocks held the offender's legs, while the pillory locked their head and hands. These devices were used for offenses like insulting authority, drunkenness, and petty theft. The punishment was not just about physical discomfort. It was about degrading the individual in front of their neighbors, ensuring that their shame would be witnessed by everyone. One of the most infamous punishments in colonial America was public whippings. Those found guilty of certain crimes, such as theft or counterfeiting, would be marked with a hot iron, usually on the face or hand. The woman would be tied to a chair, which was then lowered into a body of water repeatedly. The punishment was humiliating, intended to drown the person's voice and silence their complaints. This form of punishment was symbolic of the era's strict gender roles, where women who were seen as overly vocal or unruly were often punished in public and cruel ways. This permanent mark would identify them as criminals for the rest of their lives. The act of branding was not only painful but also stripped the individual of their dignity, as they were marked for life as a person who had violated the law. Another horrifying punishment was the stocks and the pillory. Perhaps one of the most brutal forms of punishment was branding. The ducking stool was another form of punishment used primarily against women, especially those accused of being gossips or troublemakers. In the case of adultery, colonial America had severe punishments for both men and women. Execution was also an accepted form of justice in colonial America, particularly for those accused of treason, murder, or witchcraft. Perhaps the most terrifying and controversial punishment was the trial by ordeal. Torture was another method of control that, although not as widely used in America as in Europe, did occasionally take place in colonial times. The dark chapter of colonial justice continued with some of the most inhumane and violent punishments, many of which were reserved for those seen as a threat to the established social order. One of the most disturbing forms of punishment in colonial America was burning at the stake, a punishment often used for witchcraft or heresy. The treatment of slaves in colonial America was also a tragic and brutal aspect of justice during this period. The Quakers in colonial America were also subjected to cruel punishments for their religious beliefs, as the Puritans considered them heretics. Another example of the cruel nature of colonial justice was trial by combat, an ancient practice where two individuals fought to the death to determine guilt or innocence. Exile was also a punishment that was used to remove those who were seen as a threat to colonial order. The fear of witchcraft and the supernatural also played a significant role in colonial punishments. In addition to physical punishment, psychological torment was used to control individuals in colonial society. As time passed, punishment in colonial America became less about public spectacle and more about control through fear and confinement.